EO and In-situ fusion. I'm chairing. My name's Josh. I've never chaired before, so please be nice to me. So first of all, we've got 4 papers. There's only one bit of housekeeping in that because of the kind of change of the timetable, there's going to be a gap between paper 2 and paper 3 of 15 minutes. So you can get up and stretch your legs, you can have a chat and stuff. But without further ado, first speaking is my colleague Abby on her paper, Developing ML and Statistical Models to Study Global Ocean POC Fluxes Through Data Fusion of Sparse, Heterogeneous, and In-situ Observation.
Very long title.
And just to say as well, presentations are 15 minutes long, and we'll so 12 minutes talking and 3 minutes for questions, and we'll give you a warning when you have 1 minute left.
I'll try to stay within that. Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Abby. I'm a PhD student at the University of Exeter, and I'm also on the Environmental Intelligence CDT. So I've just finished the first year of my research, and this is actually my first conference talk. So thank you very much to the organisers for giving me this opportunity. So today I'll give a conceptual overview of my research, so the type of questions that I'm trying to answer, my approaches, and what I found so far. And so before I get started into the specifics of my project, I wanted to talk about something that's quite important to me, which plays a big role in my PhD, and I'd say fits in quite well with the session theme, which is the idea that generally we're finding in the environmental sciences that there's very much an increase in the number and the variety of data sources that we have available to study a system or a phenomenon. So whether that be remote sensing data, which often has great coverage, whether that's in situ measurements, which is often the most direct measure of whatever it is we're trying to study, whether that's model outputs, so things like synthetic data that we can get from theoretical or empirical models, and even in some cases we have social media data, which can very much augment how we view a system. Now, what I'm very interested in is thinking about how we bring these different types of data together, accounting for their differences in a way that allows us to get a better, more improved and better informed view of the system we're trying to understand. And so even within these data types, for example, with in situ measurements, even if we have different in situ data that comes from different sources, how do we bring those together that account for their uncertainties and differences? And that's what I'm interested in. And I'm applying that to the field of oceanography. So in particular, I'm trying to better understand vertical ocean carbon transport. My research is generally involved with these 3 data sources, as unfortunately there's not much social media data in the ocean to do with carbon, as you can imagine. So to talk a bit more about vertical transport of organic carbon, that's better known as the biological carbon pump, depicted in this diagram on the right. To very briefly summarize what's happening here, we have atmospheric carbon dioxide by the surface of the ocean that gets dissolved into the water and then gets taken in by organisms like phytoplankton via photosynthesis. And then there are several complex biological processes that occur that mean that that carbon, which is now stored in the phytoplankton, slowly sinks further down into the ocean. There are some processes that mean that that carbon travels upwards and even sometimes back out into the atmosphere, but for the most part, a lot of it sinks. So why do we want to understand this carbon pump? Well, we know that the ocean plays a very important role in the global carbon cycle. It very much acts to regulate atmospheric carbon dioxide. And we know that the ocean acts as a carbon sink. So understanding what environmental factors influence these processes is very important. And we also know that at depth, a lot of ecosystems rely a lot on different nutrients that are present, so things like carbon and nitrate. So understanding how they're distributed is also very important. So the way that we monitor this carbon transport is via a measure known as particulate organic carbon flux, or POC flux, which is basically a measure of how much organic carbon passes through a point or an area in time. And so there are several ways to measure this in situ. So the first being a sediment trap, which is here in this image. So these sediment traps get deployed out into the ocean and left there for weeks to months, then get taken out, and then sediment is trapped within these tubes, and then those tubes get taken back to the lab and get analyzed. From there, we can get a POC concentration, and then from there, we can estimate a POC flux. Now, the second data source that we have actually often relies on sediment traps, but uses a completely different method to actually infer a flux. So this relies on 234 thorium, which is a radioactive nucleus. And the way that we infer a POC flux is by looking at the relationship between thorium and its parent nucleus, and that gives us a measure of how much particulate carbon is transported down into the ocean. So it measures a different thing, but there are several calculations that can be used to infer a POC flux. And then finally, we have the third measuring instrument, the underwater vision profiler, which is the most autonomous of the measuring instruments. They're really cool. They take images of the ocean, and then you take those images and run them through algorithms that actually estimate the size of POC. And then from that, you can get a particle size distribution and several other calculations with many proxies to then infer a POC flux. So we've got a big range of different data sources, and often in current and previous work, you'll find that people will focus on data from individual data sources, which makes sense because they're all quite different in their own right. And often they'll find limitations. And the ones that I'm quite interested in can be better depicted by looking at the coverage of these instruments and the observations made. So here I have a plot of the coverage of the measuring instruments and their observations. And the first thing you'll find is that we have way more UVP measurements in the terrain, which makes sense because it's the most autonomous of the measuring instruments. You'll also notice things like the fact that a lot of the measurements are quite clustered, so they're quite close to one another. And even in some cases, you've got these horizontal and vertical lines, which is purely just because we have research cruises or these instruments that go out and naturally they'll make measurements near where they've already been. So you'll get that sort of spatial correlation. Another thing you'll notice is that the data is actually quite sparse. So this data spans roughly a 30-year period, but we can see that there's actually not a lot of data within the Indian Ocean and even the South Pacific Ocean. And then what we also find is that there's way more data in the Northern Hemisphere than in the Southern Hemisphere. So we start to see that the data sets are actually quite sparse and biased. And this is what motivates my research. How do we take all of these data sets, account for these limitations, and try to get improved measurements of fluxes? And so the motivation of my research, if we just go back to data sparsity, spatially speaking, we've got undersampled regions. Temporally speaking, you've got points in time where lots of measurements are being made when a research cruise or a measuring instrument has been deployed, and then lots of time when there aren't measurements. So you've got these sort of gaps. And in terms of biases, spatially speaking, we've got clusters of measurements. Temporally speaking, if we compare the sediment traps and the UVPs, the sediment traps get deployed over a period of time, weeks and months, whereas for the UVP, it takes an instantaneous image. So they're kind of measuring different things and parts of POC flux. And instrumentally speaking, naturally, each instrument will have its own measurement uncertainty. And methodologically speaking, I mentioned that there are different ways of inferring a flux from these three data sources, and those will have their own assumptions and proxies, which introduce more uncertainties. So this is what I'm very interested in and thinking about how we can address some of these with my research. And the way that I would like to do that is by using data fusion methods. And for me, data fusion means trying to use multiple sources of data, which usually come from different sensors, and combining them in a way that ideally gives us improved accuracy of whatever it is we're trying to estimate. So in my case, that's POC fluxes. So the first way I'm doing this and trying to address sparsity is by taking very well sampled environmental data sets. So things like temperature and chlorophyll concentrations, which come from a source of a range of different sources. So we've got some in-situ data. We've also got some remote sensing images that can get put through models to give us chlorophyll levels, for example. I'm then training a range of models, which I will also compare and contrast to then predict POC fluxes trained on the 3 flux observation data sets that we have to give us global POC flux predictions. This is actually the result of linear regression, so it's pretty cool that I can do that. And taking this approach has the added benefit of, with some certain models, we're able to actually untangle the relationship between the environmental drivers and POC fluxes, which is what I wanted to find out in the first place anyway. So this is great, and I think we can definitely say that sparsity has been addressed with this approach. However, it does not stop there. I want to see how we can combine these 3 data sources together, because I think there's a lot of value within them. And oftentimes, for example, a sediment trap might not have measurements in a certain place, but UVPs and thoriums might have made measurements there. So they can be used to enhance each other, and they can sort of learn from one another if we try to combine them. However, this is not straightforward, and you can't treat them as the same and quite literally just combine the fluxes and see what we get out of them, for reasons that can be shown by looking at some predictions that I've done. I must say that these are very much preliminary predictions, but to move forward, I have trained some random forest models on environmental data sets, the same for all 3, but trained on the individual 3 data sources. And there are some big differences that we can see. For example, with the sediment traps, we can see that the model trained on the sediment traps generally predicts fluxes to be a lot higher than the others. That's due to several offsets and biases, which have been corrected for now. But what I find really interesting, which holds for all the models that I've trained, is that differences in the spatial trends. So for example, with the UVPs, we can see that by the poles, they predict fluxes to be higher, whereas sediment traps, fluxes are predicted to be lower by the poles. And with random forests, you have the added benefit of having feature importance, which what I found with the three models was that they picked completely different variables as being important for predicting fluxes. And so this shows to me that we can't treat them as the same, and they have to be treated separately. They have to be treated differently. So the way that I want to do this is by taking these three data sources, combining them in a way that accounts for their uncertainties, their biases, their differences, and their offsets, and then producing a fused POC flux product, which accounts for all of the information from the three data sources. There are several ways of doing this. So we have Gaussian process models, which account for the uncertainties and the spatial correlation in the data sources. We have Bayesian data fusion models, which allow you to introduce prior knowledge into the system. So I could definitely discuss with the oceanographers of what we expect POC fluxes to look like in certain places. There are certain machine learning models that have been developed, which weight the data sources by how reliable and uncertain they are. And there are several others. And part of my research will be exploring these methods and seeing how they perform, which ones sort of match up with previous studies. But all in all, I think that taking a data fusion approach will ultimately give us really good results, which account for everything that we find with the three data sources and makes the most of what we actually have, given that the data sets are so sparse. So to conclude, for my research, what I want to do is better understand what actually influences vertical carbon transport in the ocean, but using all of the data sources that we have available instead of just looking at one source. However, these data sources themselves are quite sparse, they're quite biased, and I want to try and address these things. And the ways I'm doing that are by training models to predict fluxes with very well sampled environmental data sets, so things like temperature and nitrate, which we believe are related to the transport of carbon in the ocean. And from this, we'll get global flux prediction maps. And then what I also want to do is explore different data fusion methods to try and combine the three flux data sets that we have, accounting for their differences and their biases. And as part of my research, I will compare these methods and look at those predictions and see which ones seem the most reasonable. An added benefit is that we can then get bias estimates for the measurements when we're actually trying to compare them with one another. And that's really useful information to relay back to the oceanographers and the people actually making measurements. And generally speaking, I would quite like to develop a generalized framework for how we can bring together multiple sources of data from different sensors that are trying to infer the same thing to ultimately get a more improved estimate of the thing we're trying to model, which in this case is POC fluxes. So in a way that it could be used in other fields as well, where we have similar issues. Thank you for listening. Anyone has any questions? If there isn't any time, I've got my email up here, so I'll be happy to chat about the stuff I'm doing or the stuff that you're doing.
Good time.
Good time? Okay. Cool, great.
I have one question. The data set, do you have any stations or points where you've got concurrent observations from the techniques so you can test these biases?
Yeah, so that's something that I was thinking about. And actually what I find is that there is no point where measurements have been made within the same 1 degree grid cell at the same time, because the data is very sparse. It's quite an important part of the research. However, the approach I'm taking is to treat everything as a climatological month. So I mentioned that the measurements are made over a 30-year period, and I'm looking at them by month over that 30-year period, because we know there's a lot of seasonal factors that go into it. And there are quite a few within the month, but they may not be made in the same year, but it's all with the assumption that things haven't changed too much over the year. And I know that that's, something that will probably crop up, but yeah, don't have a lot of data as it is.
Any questions online? I've got questions.
Sure.
So I was interested with the in-situ measurements. What's the kind of spatial resolution of them? So if you do a sediment trap measurement on one part of the ocean, how wide an area is that good for?
We kind of treat it as a point. So the data that we actually have is usually just latitude and longitude. We know the area of the actual sediment trap, for example. But yeah, I guess you can kind of infer what area it actually covers, but we usually just treat them as point measurements rather than as like a grid or a polygon.
A few slides back, you showed a map of points, and you also mentioned that so that there are many latitudes and
Yes.
and if this is happening over 30 years, do you think there's some reasons why that is? Is it more, I don't know, just students, specific regions that need interested in that field, but if this is over 30 years, why is it that there's so much less of it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one I've been thinking about as well. So yeah, as you mentioned, it's things like where is the research interest, where is the funding as well. So if certain research institutes are interested in like North Atlantic, naturally you'll get more measurements. I've also heard that there are quite a few pirates by the Indian Ocean, and a lot of instruments get stolen, so you can't actually get the measurements. There's pirates everywhere, but I've been told in particular by the Indian Ocean. But yeah, sure, there are several reasons, and that is something I want to look into, because naturally that will impact what measurements you get. So the data will be skewed to the locations where you have lots of data, right? So yeah, great question.
What are you finding around more polar regions and both the culture bodies?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
What are your results that you're finding closer to the polar regions, and then what body are you finding a difference?
Well, so as I mentioned before, I'm finding a difference when training models on the different data sources. But in general,
I can imagine there's probably less instruments.
yeah, exactly. So it's highly uncertain. So at the moment with my models, I can't really say with great certainty what we're seeing. But hopefully soon I will. Yeah, thank you.
I think so. We should be on to the next talk just because of the time. But we, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a 15-minute break to talk 2 and talk 3 because of some scheduling hiccups. So you can use the session there. Right. Sorry, Robert.
Rob, whatever. Don't mind. Okay. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about exploring the ocean biological carbon pump using biogeochemical Argo observations. So this is actually a presentation of work led by Giorgio Dell'Olmo, based at Plymouth. Work he's been doing while based at Plymouth Marine Laboratory and for the National Centre for Earth Observation. Giorgio unfortunately couldn't be here today because he's just moved to Italy to OGS. And so he asked me if I could present this presentation on his behalf. I've been collaborating with Giorgio, and much of this work has been done by colleagues at Plymouth Marine Laboratory. I also have an interest in biogeochemical Argo float observations. I have a UKRI grant in partnership with PML and NCO, based at the University of Exeter. Okay, well, Abby very nicely described the biological carbon pump, so I won't dwell too much on this slide at the moment, but basically we're looking at a transfer of organic carbon from the surface down to the deep parts of the ocean. This biological carbon pump has many processes, both at the surface and the subsurface. It's a very important flux of carbon. We're looking at between 5 and 12 petagrams of carbon per year that gets transferred from the surface to depth. If we were to switch this pump off, the atmospheric CO2 concentrations would be about 50% higher, or 200 ppm higher than they are today. The world would be very different. And this pump also transfers organic matter to depth where it sustains fisheries. So it's an important a food source to many of the fish, certainly down in the Mesopelagic. However, we have large uncertainties with this flux. You can see in terms of our magnitude, big uncertainties, what are the processes driving this flux of carbon, where the remineralization of carbon, so the conversion from organic back to inorganic form, at what depth does that occur, how will this change in the future? And these uncertainties principally are due to the lack of observations. Okay, so I'm a satellite kind of biological oceanographer, so I'm going to kick off the satellite observations first and just highlight a European Space Agency project led by Shubha Sathi and Joanna called BICEP, where we've been looking at how satellite observations can help improve our understanding of this pump. We had a review paper out last year in Earth Science Reviews on how a review of how satellites can be used to look at this pump. And we've also just submitted a scientific roadmap on how satellites can contribute to our understanding and what are the priorities for the next decade. Now, in both these papers, we strongly emphasize the need for routine observations at depth to view those processes and those pools of carbon that we can't see from space. Fortunately, we have these wonderful autonomous observations now, Argo floats. So for those of you who may not know much about Argo floats, I'm sure many of you do, but I'm just going to recap what they are. They're basically floating devices, platforms, whereby we put on a suite of oceanographic sensors. We deploy these platforms from a research vessel. They sink to a drifting depth of around 1,000 meters, where they normally drift for between 5 or 10 days, depending on how you program them. And then once a week or so, they drop to 2,000 meters, do a profile of oceanographic properties, and send that data via satellite. And they typically last for around 5 years, continuously making these observations. And now traditional Argo floats measure temperature, salinity, and depth, but we're talking about biogeochemical Argo floats here. And they, in addition to those physical variables, they also measure things like oxygen, pH, so the acidity of the water, the nutrient concentrations, nitrate, chlorophyll concentration, which is a proxy for the phytoplankton in the water, particular backscattering, which we can link with our POC, as Abby mentioned, I was talking about before, also measuring downwelling light. And these are very complementary actually to satellite observations, because some of these variables like chlorophyll backscattering and photosynthetically available radiation, we can estimate from satellite. But of course, these variables give us information depths deeper than the satellite signal penetrates. Okay, so at present there are around 482 of these floats in the ocean, measuring some, many, some, all of these 6 variables I just discussed. And there are plans within the International Argo Programme to have around 1,000 of these in the ocean in the coming years that are routinely collecting these observations. Okay, so what I'm going to do from now on is just highlight some case studies from the work we've been doing using biogeochemical Argo floats to improve our understanding of this flux of carbon. I'm going to focus initially on high latitudes, and then I'm going to move to lower latitudes, though there is some overlap in the case studies I'm going to discuss. And then just wave the flag that these case studies are based on our research and not necessarily representative of all the work going on within the community. Okay. So I'm first going to highlight some work that was led by Giorgio a few years back, looking at the stocks of particular organic carbon in the Norwegian Sea. So here we have a time series of backscattering observations from these floats in the Norwegian Sea, 2-year time series. As I mentioned earlier, the backscattering coefficient is a good proxy for the particular organic carbon from small particles in the ocean. And what we can do with these floats is we can produce stocks of POC, and then we can integrate those stocks over time and over different depth levels in order to estimate net POC fluxes from the basically temporal variations in these stocks. And what Giorgio found with this work he did in the Norwegian Sea, a couple of things. Firstly, actually how important small particles are in these fluxes of carbon when compared with independent measurements, some of which Abby was mentioning before, sediment traps and other things. The fluxes were in good agreement with those measurements, really highlighting the importance of the small particles. And the other thing to notice is that these stocks, we're seeing large fluxes of carbon below the mixed layer when the mixed layer shoals. So the mixed layer is this region of turbulence at the surface of the ocean, wind-driven or spherically driven, which fluctuates through the year, shoals in the summer and is much deeper in the winter. So when we see this shoaling, we see a big change in this flux of carbon. And this led on to some other work that led by Giorgio, published a few years back in Nature Geosciences, where they used Argo floats, where we use Argo floats together with CCI products, so this is satellite products, to quantify a process called the mixed layer carbon pump. So this process basically occurs when you come out of winter and move into spring, and your mixed layer begins to shoal, but it's quite unstable, so it fluctuates. So initially it shoals, and with a shallower mixed layer, you promote the light availability in the surface mixed layer and cause a phytoplankton bloom. But because the mixed layer is unstable, it can suddenly go deep again. And this fluctuation of the mixed layer is pumping organic carbon from the surface to depth. So it's a physical process that's causing this transfer of organic carbon to depth. That's different from our traditional gravitational flux, which would be measured with a sediment trap, like Abby was showing earlier. And so using Argo and CCI data, we quantified this flux of carbon and actually found out that, especially at high latitudes, it contributes quite a large contribution to our export flux, as much as the gravitational flux of carbon in some regions. Lower latitudes, of course, less so. Okay, so another thing we can do with these floating devices is by looking at profile optical signatures. So sorry, we have backscattering here as a function of depth. So backscattering is optical backscattering. We send out a beam of light, it interacts with the object, and we record the light essentially backscattered into the next to the sensor. And the background signal from this backscattering light we know is associated with small particles. But when large particles go in front of the sensor, we get these spikes. So what we can do is we can separate out the background signal here from small particles and look at the spikes to get some information about the large particles. And this in this plot here, we have a plot of a phytoplankton bloom and spikes in the backscattering here, and you can see how these large particles are sinking out of the water column as a function of time. Now, what happens when they sink is they can begin to fragment. So this process called fragmentation, where they're sinking out of the euphotic zone and they're getting eaten by zooplankton and other things, other physical processes happening as well to break these large particles up into smaller particles. These smaller particles then don't sink with such speed as the large particles, and they get remineralized more quicker. So basically, in this study that was led by Nathan Briggs with Giorgio, they showed that this process of fragmentation can contribute as much as 50% of the flux in POC. So it's an incredibly important process in this gravitational sinking of organic matter. And as they stated in their paper, likely the most important process that determines how fast the remineralized CO2 is also then returned to the atmosphere. So really important for how the ocean is absorbing atmospheric CO2. And this was published in Science a couple of years ago. Okay, so some ongoing work that's happening at the moment. What we're looking at a lot is how we can smartly integrate the satellite observations we see at the surface with the information we get at depth from the 5G chemical Argo floats in order to produce these sort of 3-4-dimensional fields of POC, which we can use to improve our understanding of ocean biological carbon bank. So we're looking at things like, this is a high latitude phytoplankton bloom here. Does the timing of this bloom, its magnitude, how does that then impact some of these processes that we've just been discussing in the previous slides? Okay, so moving towards low latitude regions now. So for those of you, one more minute, okay, great. Those of you more familiar with the low latitudes, we have what we call a deep chlorophyll maximum down at depth. So we're looking at the euphotic zone here where phytoplankton grow, and we have this deep chlorophyll maximum, which is basically a region where phytoplankton are close to the nutricline. They can get the nutrients and there's just enough light for them to keep growing. It's a permanent feature in the tropical, much of the tropical oceans, and it's a semi-permanent feature at high latitudes as well. Now, our satellite can't see this deep chlorophyll maximum, so we've been looking at ways how we can partition our profile into what the satellite can see and what it cannot, in order to study how this deep chlorophyll maximum impacts this ocean biological carbon bank. And there's a presentation on Thursday. It's the last presentation of the day on Thursday on this, if you want to learn a bit more about it. But finally, just to illustrate how this could be important, this is some oxygen data in the South Atlantic gyre, so the oligotrophic gyre in the South Atlantic. And what we're seeing, some interesting features in this data here, for instance, enhanced oxygen production in the autumn with this float, which cannot be seen in the surface signatures at all, and that we believe is linked to dynamics of the subsurface phytoplankton population. Now, the oligotrophic gyres are vast and have traditionally been neglected in terms of their contribution to the ocean biological carbon pump, because the particle signals are low, but perhaps they're a lot more important than we think they are. Okay, so to sum up, important uncertainties remain in a major planetary flux of carbon, and these uncertainties are simply due to a lack of observations. As my previous presenter, Abby, showed how sparse many of the observations are. But biogeochemical Argo floats are allowing us to make significant progress in understanding these processes and quantifying the intensity and efficiency of this pump. Okay, so thank you for listening.
All right, we've got time for questions. So has anyone got any questions?
I've got a couple of quick ones. The first one is, can you locate them geographically, or are they just free floating and they go wherever they go?
Yes, so basically they sink to 1,000 meters, and at their drifting depth, you can't locate right. But when they reach the surface, they send their signal. They have GPS, so we know where they are when they reach the surface, so we can geolocate the profiles. But of course, exactly how they move between the two profiles, we can't.
So you can't control it then?
No, they're passive floats. They're not like gliders where we can program them where to go. You can, however, though, program them via satellite, so you can change their profiling scheme, for instance. You can switch sensors off if you want, switch sensors on. Often, some scientists have managed to increase the profiling when they see an interesting feature, say like a phytoplankton bloom.
And then a second question is, so it looks like you're constraining carbon flux into the deep ocean. I'm just wondering about what you think about how much further down that whole carbon cycle your results are useful for. And I'm thinking about sort of like sediment flux onto the tectonic plates, and then delivery to that into the deep ocean.
Yes, so this whole sort of presentation is particularly focused on export production, which one has various definitions for, but typically you're looking at the amount of organic carbon that sinks out of the photic zone, basically going into the mesopelagic. Now, how that carbon, what happens to that carbon then? I mean, the deeper it goes, the longer it's kept away from the atmosphere in principle. But that also depends on where you are in the ocean, physical circulation. But yeah, we're not talking about sequestration or carbon burial. But you know, there are, I mean, these floats profile top 2,000 meters, so that's where we can see things. I mean, I know there's efforts within the International Argo program to look at deep Argo, so to go deeper. But yeah, export production is what we're looking at here.
All right, so technically, time has elapsed this presentation, but as I said, we've got a 15-minute break because of the changing time in the timetable, because something dropped out. So chat about what you want, basically. 15 minutes, have a bit of a walk around, or do whatever, and then we'll start again at 2:45 with Barrow. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah. Wow, I didn't recognize you, haven't you?
No,
when I lost contest, you were ordnance survey. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the guy
research, so that's the thing. So I was thinking you used to be doing
yeah. I was he's working at campus.
Yeah.
In the game. Oh, right.
Yeah. Yeah, not so much on the safe now, but more about yeah, interesting stuff. using satellite observations, many of the
So
similar kind of
it's
processes.
it's like a sort of pitch, maybe.
I'm sure I'm not gonna be because
That's what
graphic sense.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
it's worth
We need a new radar satellite for
Yeah.
speed or pressure. Yeah, I think we need antithetical. I think she got captured. Yeah, what I'm saying. I like that, but I don't blame her.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm living in yeah, yes.
We start.
Yeah, he's gone to OGS in Italy.
Yeah, of course.
Absolutely wasted.
There's a few that, yeah. Lockdown and I think we have like rules on the other.
But yeah, I started exiting. So I do, I mean, I do.
Oh, you know. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Hopefully make it a bit more complicated. And in fact, that's right.
Yes, that's yeah.
So I think we can discuss it.
This weird stuff.
Yeah.
I was kind of fun like it. It's good.
I don't know. I need to.
No, I'm
enjoying it.
Yeah, I need to. I mean, I look at.
Oh,
The presentation about prospects or something like that.
Yeah, but
Yeah, it's all right. Yeah. Probably one of the most. You can fit into most.
yeah, and yeah, you can. I mean, it's switching off as well. Leads to that life.
They don't expect gallery yeah, but it's also oh, is it? Made a lot. That's why. Yeah, like most people have big things.
Yeah.
She's not what you're doing. Like a real thing for
I
the.
think there's all the other stuff. Expectation.
There's always something as you go as librarian. Lectures, that's what the branch of the government. Not the political actually has that thing shaky and work.
Oh, okay.
The editorial assistant.
Yeah, so I get all these sort of conferences.
Yeah.
Travel still.
But these are all the standard jobs. Anything from here. Yeah. Basically anything. Yeah. So. Yeah. I don't
Your life since we last changed it up, it's really, yeah, keeping in touch. Then came along That's right. Yeah. So that was
I'm not sure.
Yeah. So my youngest is 3.
Right,
So
so
you just born 2019.
rigorously fine.
Yeah, so it was 2015, 2017, 2019. So 3, 5, and 7. So they keep me on the toes a bit these days. And yeah,
Basically, every
discussion
installation
is
is
a
like
help.
we were trying to be intelligent.
Yeah.
So,
So yeah, that's going all right. It's getting tough.
yeah,
though.
they do like quite, I don't know.
Hard housing,
You've got all that.
issues, horrendously expensive. We're getting booted out of our rental at the moment. So there's a few issues with that. But we love it. I love living, you know, striking there, a good surfing beach.
Like you'll find which is
Lovely found small.
I guess I come down more.
You would have done. No. I know.
Yeah,
they used to take a shit
Is
down.
also.
So you were doing ocean rugby.
I would say.
That would have probably been.
It's all very white now. Totally on it. So I get a little bit more more movement. So
Wait down one is.
Oh,
I see. Yeah. So that is.
That's not quite.
You
Likewise. You said you did. Yeah, just about midday.
a lot.
You want to go close to the direction of life.
I need to get back to it. And I do love stuff.
So, we've got.
Why don't you like?
I see that.
I totally really enjoy doing that. You would be there.
I have no idea.
Interesting. Yeah. You would act doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, lovely to. Nice. Yeah, you can hang around. Yeah.
But it's slightly
But yeah, no, that'd be really, that would be great. But would they only have?
Yeah, it's like-
Would they like?
So although it's undergoing.
they probably go big stuff. Some like that they made in which if you go to I think you would budget only on the smaller projects.
Yeah, well, it's like an ongoing thing.
Yeah, but I don't know.
But yes, the methodology is.
Right, yes, always.
It's standardized.
That's all. But it's like find more finance based, yeah, more good out that's like risk analysis.
But, you know, the reason they're on.
Whether it could be absolutely
It's very interesting about this stuff.
really
I just think it's quite sad.
I mean, they-
At this point, sea fills the hull and it starts to grow.
Definitely environmental.
And reading about the life cycle of animals. It's gonna be another space different.
They do something with equations. I don't know what it is.
I feel like there's so many other, so many other negative things in the ocean. So
It is. incredibly advanced. Yeah, you can get very high up there.
Mega dynamic
Yeah, but it's reasonably well made. Yeah, well,
It's always unless you can.
Over 1 minute ahead of schedule, just to make sure we set up time. I thought we'd get started again. So please welcome the next speaker, Daniel Gerber, with the paper Baradar, Barometric Differential Absorption Radar Bench Model Demonstrator. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So yeah, my name is Daniel Gerber. I am not Imal Rumi. I'm giving that presentation on behalf of my colleague. So I'm just saying that you don't put your expectations too high. I hope I can live up to it. So we're from RAL Space in Oxfordshire, and a part of RAL Space is the Chilbolton Observatory, the picture to the right, with this large 25-meter weather radar. We're a group that builds microwave radiometers. The EMAL is from the Chilbolton laboratory. They have a whole lot of radars that they've built and operate down at Chilbolton, mostly for metrology. They also have weather station, and that's where basically the using radars for metrology comes together. The outline of the talk is a quick introduction, the justifications why we want to build the measurements and acquire the data that we want, some user requirements, and then some photos of a bench model that we've been building. Well, Imal has been building, and future work and plans. So Baradar stands for Barometric Differential Absorption Radar. So it's an active instrument, sends a radar pulse to the bottom, gets the same pulse back in the oxygen line, and from the difference we get oxygen and pressure in the atmosphere. And it's the first time really that surface pressure would be measured from space directly. So surface air pressure, it's quite an important parameter. The atmosphere itself, it's gas, but it's also a liquid. So pressure and temperature are really the two things that define the gas. And for most part of the globe, where the atmosphere lies on top of the ocean is a liquid as well. It can give way. So surface pressure kind of pushes in both ways, changes the sea height. So it's quite a key parameter. So it's frustrating that we can't measure it from space. We started in 2017 to look at the mission concept, see if it can be done. And then at the second phase for this ESA started to look at the antenna a bit more. We then had some national funding through the COI to build the first prototypes, just a bench model on the bench. Now we have, at the moment, we're just building the second prototype with 3 channels and preparing another proposal for an airborne demonstrator for the instrument. Justification, climate change. We don't have to make a case for climate change. Everyone, I think, hopefully agrees that it's really critical. And one thing we've observed so far, again, I think no one really doubts that, is that through climate change, we've seen much more extreme weather events and much more frequent extreme weather events. Specifically hurricanes, typhoons, and massive thunderstorms. And we found out, well, at least Met Office told us that these kind of surges in hurricanes are underrepresented in current models. So we're not quite on top of that. And pressure really is the key parameter in the formation of, for example, tropical thunderstorms and hurricanes. So the Met Office, they are really, really keen to get surface pressure measurements. And then it's also true that most other EO missions that do, for example, altimetry or wind measurements or temperature, gravity, they use surface pressure as a kind of proxy information in their retrieval analysis, which currently comes from models. But there's limited measurements. So just that goes into a bit more detail. Numerical weather prediction, it has kind of 2 steps: an analysis step where they make the model fields match and observations of the atmosphere. It's also called assimilation. You take measurements and you see that the model matches these. And then the forecast step, the model runs and it tells you what the planet will do in the future. And in terms of observations, we have lots of passive instruments. We have infrared instrument like YASI. We have microwave instrument, AMSU, and MWS. We've got radio occultation, and radio occultation is you measure the wet delay of the GPS satellites disappearing over the horizon, and that gives you a pressure profile in the atmosphere down to about 15 kilometers, and from that you can infer surface pressure. But because you don't really get anything below 15 kilometers, there's a bit of an error in there, and also the horizontal resolution is quite bad, 300, 500 kilometers. So that's where having the radar mission would be really helpful, because it gives a much better horizontal resolution, and it goes all the way down to the surface and back in its information content. And then the other thing we have is in situ measurements. So this is an example of some pressure buoys floating in the sea. They're on ships, they're on oil rigs as well. Some people go into the Arctic to place them, but it's very time consuming, very expensive way to get surface pressure. So you can't really cover all the oceans, and on land, obviously, it's a bit easier. You can have a pressure sensor. Not every met station has one. This is a distribution of all the in situ measurements we have. So clearly over land, we have a whole lot of met stations, and then over the sea, far and few between the measurements we have. And in the southern hemisphere, very little, almost nothing. That's a distribution by latitude. So only about 30% of the Earth is currently kind of covered by surface pressure measurements. And of those 30%, 90% of it is just over land in the northern hemisphere. Really not a representative situation. And satellite remote sensing is really the only way to get a global picture at the same time. So this plot from a study, this is a data denial experiment run by the colleagues at the Met Office, where they've run their forecast model by removing all the surface pressure information. And they show us that it's pretty much the polar regions here and there, and a little bit the ITC that are most sensitive to surface pressure knowledge. So that's why we think if you build a satellite mission, you want it to be a polar orbiter, that you have the poles covered. The spatial resolution would be about 5 to 5 kilometers, so much and better resolved than the radio occultation gives you, and that would be suitable to be assimilated even in the high resolution MET models. I'm not sure if there was supposed to be a plot in there or not, but there's probably supposed to be a table in there. So basically, I think the missing table here would show the mission requirements, the user requirements, in terms of repeat cycle, in terms of horizontal resolution, and in terms of the pressure. Actually, a bit of a shame that it's not here. We got that from a study, the first ESA study we've done. We've had a user survey where we talked about the metrologist, the ocean physicist, oceanographer, gravity, the people who measure the gravity, and climate scientists, and a fifth group that I can't remember, unfortunately. I can't look it up. So they've provided us with a whole set of requirements, and we've looked at that, and I think the conclusion is that if we can measure surface pressure with an accuracy of about half a hectopascal, that would be a really significant benefit to the numerical weather prediction community. And then the oceanographic community, they were even more demanding. They want 0.2 hectopascal. And I think at the start, when we did the feasibility study, we saw that, yeah, we can do 1 hectopascal for sure. And meeting these requirements is quite challenging. So we had a new iteration where we tweaked the antenna and the measurement concept a little bit to achieve that. So it's kind of, it'll be tough, but we think we could get that as well. So this is a picture of the atmosphere, the spectral the spectral lines, the main spectral lines in the atmosphere. You've got the water vapor line here, and then you've got oxygen. So from these spectral lines, normally what you do in atmospheric remote sensing, where I come from, is you assume you know the pressure and the temperature, and then from the shape of the line you can get the mixing ratio. Here we're trying to do the other thing. We're trying to kind of assume the mixing ratio and get the pressure out. And luckily for oxygen, we can do that because oxygen uniquely is well mixed in the atmosphere. We always know how much there is. So we can assume we know oxygen, make the measurements, one on the line wing and, or in the line towards the line center, one in the wing. And from the ratio, we can then get the pressure. And the total pressure is a proxy for the surface pressure. That's how the technique works. So we have two radar frequencies that give us a pair on the wing and the top, and then we have a third channel to get two ratios just to get the error down a bit, but it could be done with two. This is a breakdown of the concept of the instrument, and we can't really read the text. So I can skip that foil, which is good for me because I'm not an engineer. But basically, you have a radar that emits a pulse that needs to be generated, and then you've received the pulse, and you need the receiver. So there's two modules: a sender, a transmitter, and a receiver. This is a picture of the bench model. So you can see there's one main antenna. It's a Cassegrain reflector with a mirror here. Signal goes in, and there's a kind of diplexers here. There's these two channels. Which transmit the pulse and receive it back again. And we're working on a 3-channel version at the moment. This is just a system design of the tests they were running at the Chilbolton Observatory. And again, can't read it, so might as well skip it. This is a photo of the Chilbolton site again. And so basically what our colleagues have been doing is they've got this test site. It's 500 meters long, used to be used for radio communication research. So you put the radar inside this cabin here. You've got a PTFE window. You send the pulse down. There's a reflector. It comes back. That would be the satellite. That would be the Earth's surface. And then you see test whether the system works. So the future roadmap is we've got that prototype. We're going to add the 3rd channel, and then once that's completed, we're trying to get funding to build an airborne demonstration that would go on the UK FAM research aircraft, and then we basically demonstrate the same technique from an aircraft with the radar actually pointing down and getting the real reflection from the surface. So that's going to be the next step, and then from that on in the future, in-orbit demonstration and maybe an ESA mission. Never know. That's probably the last slide yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have I got any questions?
Yeah.
Nice talk. Given the sparsity of observations in the ocean, have you thought of tapping into some other existing platforms like sail drones or wave drones or system sites, vessels to give more pressure measurements?
So what are those? Are those like remote controlled ships?
Yes, the sail drones are essentially autonomous devices that you deploy, and they're either pushed by wind or by solar energy, and they essentially transverse across the oceans. You can program them, and they're very long duration vessels, so you can let them go for months on end. There's a lot of work done in the Pacific and the Atlantic transecting across the Pacific, and as I understand, they have meteorological measurements on them, so they may very well have surface pressure data on them already. And then, of course, a lot of the research vessels and even some of the yachts that people use and things have basic net stations on. I don't know about the accuracy of the pressure sensors, but they could be good platforms to increase the observation. I guess you need a lot of data to validate this once it starts going.
Yeah, definitely. So I don't think it's going to remove the need for satellite measurements because you need millions of those little drones to.
Yeah, I'm just.
But yeah, I no idea if the Met Office at the moment use it, if they're part of the sparse dots that we see. Maybe some of them are, maybe not. I can't.
Yeah, I guess you'd probably see tracks, I would imagine, with these devices rather than single points.
Yeah. Some of them definitely they will be on ships, cruise liners.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty sure used so far, so they could use it. Accuracy probably not an issue because for assimilation, the whole network of surface pressure sensors, they all have different accuracies, they have biases.
Yeah.
There needs to be a way to cope with that already. There must be one, I presume. So, I've never heard about of these things.
Yeah, no way would it replace a satellite. So don't get me wrong, it's like
an Argos float that never dives, basically.
Yeah, they just go across the surface, measuring stuff in the water, but also stuff in the atmosphere as well. People have been putting on a gas CO2 sensors on them and things to measure CO2 levels in the ocean, things like that. But I'm happy to send you some links.
Yeah, how big are they? I struggle to picture them.
7 meters long.
7 meters, okay, so like a proper boat.
Yeah, some of them have got big sails as well. Others have just got solar panels or use the wave motion so they last for long periods of time.
Do they take passengers?
No.
Other questions?
So we've got 1 minute, so if there's like a super
Yeah.
quick question, but if not, we should move on to the.
Yeah, just send an email to email if you can think of something. Better place to answer.
All right,
Thank you.
all right, that's great. All right, so now we have our last presentation of the day, Sensor Technologies for Characterizing and Monitoring Soil Functions by Nelly Desvero. So take it away.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Nelly Desvero. I am a research scientist at Rosamsted Research here in the UK, but the talk I want to share with you today was developed during my PhD back in Brazil at the University of São Paulo. So I want to talk and give an overview about how to use and integrate different kind of sensors for understanding, characterizing, and monitoring soil functions. And soil functions are strongly related with ecosystem services. We can define soil functions in several ways, but one of the most used definitions is that soil functions are goods and services that soils can provide to humans or for humans or for human welfare. And we have 6 specific soil functions. For example, soil has the capacity to produce biomass, to be a host for biodiversity, to filter, store, transform nutrients and water, also to be a source of raw materials, to be an archaeological heritage, and finally, and one of the most important functions in the last years of soils is about its capacity to store and sequester soil carbon for helping mitigating climate change. However, we have key issues and facts that we need to consider. And direct measurements of soil function is extremely difficult. And that's why physical, chemical, and biological soil properties, such as soil texture, pH, nutrients, soil organic matter, are used as indicators of these soil properties. But there we have another problem, that despite the huge improvements in methods, technologies, and protocols for measuring these soil properties, they are still very expensive and time-consuming, and especially in developing countries like Brazil and South America, where we don't have reliable soil data and incomplete databases about soil properties. And that's why we are advocating for the use of integration of different kind of technologies and sensors, and like soil spectroscopy, spectral data, remote sensing, satellites, drones, and sensors that can be used directly in the field to collect this information, because this can help us to obtain a lot of different soil data in a more efficient way than to complete regional or global data sets. And we are seeing a huge interest, especially in the soil science community, and those research trends can prove this. For example, if I did a quick search in Scopus and Google Academics relating topics about soil functions, remote sensing, and spectroscopy, you are seeing that the soil science community really wants to understand better how to integrate these sensors to use for soil studies. And how can we use this information collected from sensors directly? Information, you can have spectral data or information on elements, soil color that can directly obtain it from sensors. Indirectly, where you can use soil properties in situ data to build models and to estimate soil properties, and also integration from other tools or data that I will explain later. And here we can collect information from sensors in the form of reflectance or absorbance values, mainly in the UV, in the visible and the infrared regions, dielectric or electromagnetic characteristics from the soil, count per second or percentage of specific elements. And in the figure, you are seeing, for example, that we can collect information from the soil for the whole electromagnetic spectrum. For example, we have gamma rays, we have sensors that collect gamma rays from the soil in the field and from airplanes. X-ray fluorescence that you can also collect in the field or in the laboratory. The LIBS, which is the laser induced breakdown spectroscopy, the spectral region where we have the satellites, Sentinel, Landsat, drones, and also sensors that can be used in the field, the GPR, which is the radar, which is mostly related and can be used for collecting information on soil moisture or soil texture, the thermal region, and also about the microwave region. And here I bring a table in which I want to show the main soil properties and which kind of sensors can be used to obtain this information. So you have, for example, texture, which is the distribution of soil particles in the soil color, organic matter, soil organic carbon, pH, minerals, soil moisture, temperature, and elements. And you can see there the description of each sensor that I show in the last picture and which one can be related or can be used to estimate the soil properties. But a key point here to keep in mind is that not all those soil properties have a good accuracy. So for example, for macronutrients or nutrients in the soil, nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, which are important for soil, for plant nutrition, usually they are not very good or very well estimated from these sensors. So this is good to keep in mind. And because we're here talking a lot about Earth observation and satellites, I bring this figure in which I want to show the potential use of satellite images. So you are seeing there base map, ArcGIS base map, normal true color composition figure. And this one is a synthetic soil image, which was obtained by averaging or by calculating the median reflectance of a time series of Landsat of 40 years. And with just this image, we can have a lot of insights about the soil variability. Just seeing this image, I can say, for example, that the dark colors has more clay and the light colors has more sand, for example. And from this, I can say that these dark color soils can produce more biomass or can store more carbon or can have more organic matter or they are more productive, for example, if we consider the agricultural point of view. And here I bring also the relationship of the soil properties because we can use those soil properties as indicators of the soil functions. And you are seeing there the main soil functions that I mentioned at the beginning about biomass production, carbon pool, about being a biodiversity pool. And in pink, you can see the main soil properties that are easily estimated from sensing technologies. But here we also have other soil properties that you need to obtain from other kind of measurements or going to the field or from other sensors, because this you cannot obtain from the sensors that I mentioned. Soil structure, for example, you need to go to the field and try to understand. And those are important properties that you need to measure for understanding specific soil functions. And I bring here some examples from Brazil, 3 examples of soil functions. The first one is about soil as a biomass producer. And in this example, the authors use satellite images, the one I mentioned you before, to estimate soil properties and to use these soil properties as inputs for a crop modeling. If you remember, I mentioned it earlier that you can integrate satellite or sensors with other tools to obtain information on soil functions. And in this case, it was used satellite images and crop modeling for estimating the inherent capacity of soil to produce sugarcane. Sugarcane is a very important crop back in Brazil. And from this map, you can show where, for example, this soil has a high capacity for producing sugarcane here in the green area. The second example is about soil as a reservoir for water. And it's the same example in which the authors use satellite images from Landsat and integrated this information in a process-based model, which was the SWAP, to estimate plant water availability, because this is again soil property that is very difficult to measure, so you need to estimate from process-based modeling. But this process-based modeling requires a lot of input data that again is expensive, and that's why you are using information estimated from satellites to obtain this kind of data. And you can see that where are the areas that the soil has an inherent capacity for storing more water that can be available for the plant. And the third one is about soil as a carbon pool. Nowadays, soil scientists are really interested on measuring and mapping soil organic carbon for carbon credit, for carbon markets, and they want to understand where are the soils that can store more carbon. And in this case, this is a map from Brazil, just the cropland areas, and the authors used satellite images, the spectroscopy, and other sensors in the field to estimate soil organic carbon and to map soil organic carbon stocks and their uncertainties, also using machine learning. So there are a lot of possibilities for integrating different kind of sensors and understanding better our soil resources. So thank you very much. I will be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Any got any questions?
That's very interesting talk. I wonder, have you tried to go from the bigger picture with satellite imageries down to, say, a sort of sample pit, and then start logging the profiles in sort of sample pit using the different types of sensors to compare them with the bigger picture?
Yeah, we did a lot that in Brazil during my PhD. So usually you go to the field first and use a field sensor to collect and then to compare satellite images. This is a very common practice and it's really good. The problem is that a lot of people want to just use remote sensing and forget about the field sampling. And remote sensing is in the surface, and the soil, you have a lot of information in depth. So
through Brazil, have you got a set of standard practices for that sort of spectrally based or field-based remote sensing? Is there a standard practice or a set of standard guidelines?
Not yet. We are trying to include. My supervisor in Brazil is building a big project about spectral libraries in Brazil, but he's still alone, so there are not so many people interested in this. So he's trying to build this solid spectral libraries and to include in common classification of surveys programs.
Thanks for the talk. You showed a bit earlier on a synthetic soil image that you said was 40 years of Landsat data. I just wondered, could you just explain how you got to that and what it tells us?
Yeah, this one is published. The name is GEO-S3. It was published in Remote Sensing of Environment in 2018, and there's another paper in Nature, in Scientific Reports in 2020, showing a whole map for the whole world. And the first one was developed for Brazil, and you can use spectral indices, NDVI and BR2, to exclude vegetation and water, and also quality bands to exclude clouds and shadows. And then you aggregate all these images. You do all of it in Google Earth Engine, and then just take the median or the mean reflectance, and this is the result.
Okay, thanks. Maybe afterwards you can show me the paper. Thank you.
Welcome.
Before I talk to my question, I just to kind of bring this to use generally, what sort of data points are you looking for from industry to feed into these?
I think I didn't understand very well.
To make these from the science to use in the field, and then what data points are you looking for from the kind of space industry to feed into your? So what data do you?
Yeah, especially because the process-based models to estimate productivity or soil carbon or other kind of information, they are just point information. So from remote sensing, you can have a map. You can have a lot of information in a pixel basis. This was the example that we did in this one. They wanted to do that because you just have point information of a specific sampling points. They wanted to have a map, so a spatial overview of the soil to produce biomass. So this is a big point by using satellite information to obtain a map.
I've got a question. So I'm wondering, something I've heard ages ago, so it might not be true, so apologies, but I remember reading a while ago that some new microwave remote sensing satellites could penetrate the very topsoil with their sensors. Does that add a new dimension to this, the new sensors coming online, or is it kind of mostly?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, no. You have the GPR that can penetrate maybe 50 centimeters.
Okay.
That is in the field. With satellites, no, unfortunately.
I
no.
must have misread
Yeah,
that.
no, and that is this is a big problem. So the
In the forested areas as well, that would be a problem. And a lot of
Yeah.
you do not have that information there.
Yeah.
Unless you're moving towards, but even the LMP band, that would still be difficult.
Yeah.
And you're mentioning about the top layers, could you incorporate model data into your analysis here, where you can possibly get down to about 2 meters?
Yeah, that's why we're trying to integrate with, for example, fields or sensors that you can go in the field and use a penetrometer and go, no need to dig a pit, but sensors that can go further in depth to collect those information. And there are initiatives in the industry trying to build sensors that integrate, for example, GPR or spectral information or different kind of sensors in just one penetrometer to go maybe 1 meter deep and to collect this information.
Thank you. Let's check this slide.
I know that the Earth Explorer 9 mission biomass, in their report for science assessment, they made some claims that they can see some subsurface structure that helps them maybe find oil reserves or groundwater levels, but maybe that only works in the desert where it's super dry. I don't know.
Long wavelength radar,
That's a
go down 2 or 3 meters of dry sand. But it's diametric, probably once it gets wet, then you don't go any deeper. So it's damp sand. See the top of the sand.
You don't necessarily know how far it's gone as well. So I was going to say, yeah, in dry soil you can see like subsurface rivers.
Yeah, or drainage patterns through the desert and things like that, which are buried by wind-blown dry sand. So it works for that. But it's still useful for soil moisture measurements if you're looking at drought and aridity, or if you go the other way and you're worried about flooding and how water on the ground is.
Yeah.
So there are applications there.
But there are pros and cons with everything, aren't there? Yeah. Not an easy thing, unfortunately, if it was, we could solve it, right?
You produce geocentric spectrometry L-band measurements, so it gives you that first 5 centimeters, but after that it is very difficult.
Yeah. And the problem that we need to dig deeper to understand is very complex. So.
Right, that's it for our session. But obviously, if you want to hang around and keep chatting about soil and oceans and measuring